the yahrzeit of my my wife's father, who was yesterday Yud Zayin Adar. Name was Moshe ben Binyamin. We called him Mori Bax. Last name is Bax. He was born in 1927 in I think Glen Falls, New York, and he was raised there. He went to art school in Kansas. He was a very professional artist, and that's my wife's father met his wife, my wife's mother. They met in art school. They're both artists, and they got married. And my father-in-law was in the army kind of toward the end of the war, World War II, and basically he after the army lived in Los Angeles, basically the rest of his life, and he was I'll just say he had I think good midot. He was a good person, and Baruch Hashem, now he has children, grandchildren living in Eretz Israel, and going to yeshivas and haters and Beis Yaakov's. So it should be a zchut for him.
Well, Neshama should have an aliyah, zchus of the shir. Say Rav Shmuel's wife is also a superstar artist, so she comes by it. She comes by it honestly. Her parents are both artists, met in art school. Oh. Okay, Yeshur. Okay, so we want to start learning Hilchos Chametz and Matzah. And if you have a Mishnah Berurah, so please take the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Tuf Lamed Beis. That's where we'll start. And here's the introduction. The Torah says that Ach b'yom rishon harishon tashbisu sa'or mivatechem. And the Gemara says that you have to get rid of your chametz tashbisu. That's the word, tashbisu. It's a unique word, which we're going to have to talk about more. But you have to get rid of your chametz not on Pesach, which is what you would think 7 days you're not allowed to have chametz, you're not allowed to eat chametz. No, already from the time that you could bring the korban pesach, you're aser b'chametz. And I spoke this morning as a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon and Pesachim Chav Ches. Whether in fact you start the iser of chametz starts at chatzos, but we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda that says the iser of chametz starts at chatzos, and ach b'yom harishon, the yom harishon is referring to the day before Pesach, the day of the korban pesach. Tashbisu sa'or mivatechem, the opposite of Sugyos. Sugyos you can't be moisef on the mitzvah and say that there's an iser to eat. You could be moisef in a chodesh alachol, but you can't be moisef on the mitzvah. Over here, the mitzvah begins before the holiday begins, and the mitzvah is called tashbisu. And there's a number of things that we have to do to be mekayim the mitzvah of tashbisu. We burn the chametz. You clean your house for chametz. You could even eat chametz, the Baal Omar says, and be mekayim tashbisu that way. You got to get rid of the chametz. But the one we're going to talk about today is the mitzvah of, or the din of the chacham. Hard to say it's a mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah of Bitul Chametz. So Bitul Chametz, we know Bitul Chametz. We're familiar with Bitul Chametz from when we say Kol Chamir v'Chamia Deika B'Reshusei, that any chametz that I have in my reshus have a hefker ukafar da'ara. Two things. In the mitzvah of Bitul Chametz, how does that work? It works that somehow or another by me saying, or more important, by me thinking that I'm being mevatel the chametz, somehow or another I'm not over an avera for owning that chametz. Normally I have bayura bayimatzeh, but by doing bitul chametz, so mevatel the chametz. Machlokes Rashi and Tosfos. Follow me carefully here because this is the background information which is important. Rashi says, how do you get rid of chametz? By saying kol chamir v'chamir diikar b'shusei, or just being mevatel it belev. So Rashi says that that's a special din of tashbisu. And tashbisu allows you to do the following. You can take something which, let's say this was a beer and it was chametz. So I could take something which is important, and it's a glass of chametz, let's say. And tashbisu means that I'm making it ka'afar dara. This is not chametz, it's nothing, it's ka'afar dara. It's like afar ba'alma, it has no chashivas, has no. So you could say, well, but it does have chashivas. How can you say it doesn't have chashivas? So according to Rashi, there's a chiddush in the Torah that you can make something ka'afar dara. In your mind, you can take something which has value and make it ka'afar dara. That's by the way, that's an amazing chiddush in the Torah. This is that the tashbisu is a din unto itself. And the way it works, just to say this parenthetically, how can you take something which has value and say it has no value? So the way it works is that what you are saying is that as far as I'm concerned, it has no value, meaning I'm not allowed to have any kind of hana from this. And whenever you have something which has no hana from it at all, it's usher to have hana. So then you don't really own it. Yeah.
How's that different than hefker?
Very good. Tosfos comes along and says that there is no new chiddush din. He had a question. He asked your kasha on Rashi. He says there's no chiddush din of tashbisu, that you can take something which is important and make it ka'afar da'ara. What you can do is be mafkirit. Mafkirit is I have some kind of a legal tool which allows me to relinquish ownership from the chametz. And now that I'm saying that I don't own this any longer, so it's not that I'm taking away its value. Mamela, I'm taking away its value because if I don't own it, I don't own it. I'm not allowed to eat it. And if I'm not allowed to eat it, I don't own it. But the lumdus of it, says Tosfos, is hefker. So you have a machlokes, a very well-known machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos. If tashbisu is a din of afar da'ara, so if you're mafkir something, let's say you're mafkir your house, so you're not saying it's ka'afar da'ara, you're just saying I don't own it. You're walking away from it. Whereas if you're making something ka'afar da'ara, you're saying like it's the same thing as burning it or being mefar l'ruach, or flushing it down the toilet. It's garnished, right? It has no value at all. So that's a famous machlokes Rashi and Tosfos. Please memorize it. That Rashi says that it's a din tashbisu, and Tosfos says it's a din of hefker.
How can you do hefker without Adam?
Who says you need Adam to do hefker?
We do hefker in front of three people.
No, so that's because it should be known that it's hefker. But the etzem davar of hefker, you can be mafker something. It just doesn't have any.
Shulach HaKan, then we have to be mafker the makom by three people.
It has to be a hefker which stands up in Beis Din. So we're machmir on Shulach HaKan, but Batsam you don't have to do hefker between three people. You could just do hefker. In other words, but this by the way is a fascinating concept, that I can take something which is in my rishus. Whether you do it with a Beis Din, without a Beis Din, but let's say without a Beis Din, you can be mafker something. Fine, all over the Gemara, you can be mafker things. In fact, it's a davar shebelev. You don't even have to say anything. You can just in your mind be mafker. You don't have to do anything in front of anybody. So it's a halachic tool which can be used to say that something that I owned a second ago, I no longer own. Agav, the lawyers on the screen here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that in civil law there's any such thing as relinquishing ownership from something. For instance, if I own a stock, I can't just say I don't own a stock. Or if I own a business, I can't say I don't own that business. Or I can't say I don't own this house. I don't think you can do that. You have to deed it to somebody else or to something else, or you have to donate it to the church or something. But you can't just relinquish ownership, because otherwise, let's say there would be a drug bust, and I've got this drugs, and the policeman says, is that yours? And I say, no, and you're mafkir it. They're in the same thing with taxes. You can't just be mafkir something and say that you're not chayiv tax. So it's interesting. As far as I know, in Western law, I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I know in Western law, there is no metzias of hefker per se. Does somebody want to correct me on that, Pinchas?
No, I think you're correct.
Right.
It's definitely.
I think it depends what.
Why?
I think it depends what. There's a cat with movables, not with intangible property like stock and not with immovable property like real estate, but with movables, there is a concept called abandonment, which means that if you've left it with no intent to come back to it and no intent to reclaim it, then someone else can acquire it simply by taking possession of it. There's also
you can't do it. You can't do it with a house. You have to deed it to the courts or something.
Right.
You can't.
Although if you rent a house, if you rent property, you can also abandon it. There's usually a provision in a real estate lease that prohibits the tenant from abandoning the property and says if the tenant abandons the property, then the landlord can come back and terminate the lease. And often the lease also says that any movables that the tenant leaves behind after the end of the lease are deemed abandoned, and the landlord can either take possession of them or dispose of them however the landlord sees fit.
Could it, just to push the point a minute, Rabbi Yaakov, does that mean somebody else can also come in and take it?
Well, that's an interesting question. Probably not, because it's deemed abandoned in favor of the landlord. Now, the landlord can put it out at the curb. And once the landlord puts it out at the curb, then anyone who wants it can take possession of it.
Okay, so it's not hefker. It's not the same as hefker.
Although the landlord, interestingly, the landlord can make it hefker.
Right, that's a chiddush.
But on the other hand, I would think if he puts it out on the pavement, on the sidewalk, and it injures somebody, he's going to be chayav. In other words, there's still
or if it's something you're not allowed to own. If something you're not allowed to own, you put your car on the sidewalk, but you can't relinquish it. See, but I just by my point.
Barbershus harabim, you don't own it, but you're chayav for.
That's exactly right. In other words, the you can't be mafker. I mean, you can be mafker a bar, but the Torah puts it in your rishus. But I don't know if in secular law, if you build a bar b'rishus harabim, you're chayiv. I would imagine in secular law. The reason I'm mentioning this, and this is a very important thing, that if there's no such thing, my information last night that I spoke to an Israeli lawyer was that in the state of Israel, there's no relinquishing property. Because they want to charge, I guess, taxes and everything and responsibility for every piece of property. So if there's no such thing as relinquishing property, it means according to the Dina de Malchusa, you can't be mafkir something. So if according to Dina de Malchusa, you can't be mafkir something, so then there is no possibility for Bitul Chametz if according to Tosfos that it says it's Mishum Hefker. Let me just go. Do you hear that? That's like a huge chumrah. I was just mevato the whole institution of Bitul Chametz, but I'll give you. I just want to give a quick side lesson here.
Totally in the Malchus Adina in Eretz Yisrael?
No. Dina de Malchus Adina. First of all, probably the biggest misnomer in Jewish law is not that you have to follow the laws of the government, according to the way we paskin in Shulchan Aruch. I mean, you do have to follow the laws of the government, but that's not Dina de Malchus Adina. That's a different social contract that we have that, when we enter into a country, that we don't drive over 100 kilometers an hour on a highway or whatever. But Dina de Malchus Adina, let's understand this like Talmidei Chachamim Rabbi said. Dina de Malchus Adina means that a din that the Malchus made, a din means in Mamonos. A din a financial din that the Malchus made is called the din in Halachah. So that means to say, if legally the Malchus says that my house belongs to Yoni Palmer, for whatever reason, even if it's not a halachic reason, meaning like, let's say I owe you money, so the government confiscates my house and gives it to you. So Dina de Malchus Dina says that din that the Malchus makes, we're meshubit to, not because you have to keep the law, but because that's the din. That's the way property works. It's like a zoning law or anything else. Din of the Malchus and Dinah means the same thing, as in a way, the same kind of an idea as hefker based in hefker. Meaning if based in makes something hefker, it's hefker. If the Malchus says something belongs to me or belongs to you, that's the din. It's not about like, oh, you must listen to the laws and get vaccinated, let's say. That could be, you do have a different chiyuv, but that's not a din of the Malchus a dinah. Not. The Malchus has a right to enforce.
It sounds like here. Yeah. So I wanted to ask, because according to the Toras, if it's hefker, it sounds like maybe it's a transactional thing. In which case, how does it work on Shabbos? Like, for example, this year when we have to be mafkir chametz on Shabbos.
Because if it's not doma lemeka chamimker, you're allowed to make hefker on Shabbos. You're allowed to do transaction on Shabbos as long as it's not doma lemeka chamimker. So this according to, like, as I say, according to Tosfos, if it's true that you can't just be mevatel chametz belev and relinquish all responsibility, then you would think, I think we have an answer to this question, Baruch Hashem, but according to Tosfos, which is the shita of most of the Rishonim, by the way, that if it's a din of hefker, so being that it's, and we say, by the way, in Kol Chamir, we say both, avi hefker v'ukafar dara. That's Tosfos and Rashi. So you could say this like a lamdan this year on Shabbos. So according to that, according to Din and Malchus Adina, there should be no more institution of Bitul Chametz, if I'm correct, or you have to come up with some kind of a lumdus of relinquishing property that is true in this Malchus. In Israel, American law might be a little bit different. I'm not a lawyer or a law professor, but I do learn Gemara. So that's as an aside, but you'll see it's not such an aside for a moment. The Mishnah Berurah, this Mishnah Berurah is in Siman, not where I pointed you, but in Siman Taf Lamed Dalet Sifkat and Tezvav. You can look it up. The Mishnah Berurah says, and that I think saves the day on this one, and I believe it's a Beis Yosef, although he doesn't quote the Beis Yosef. Mishnah Berurah says that even if you'll say, according to Tosfos, that Bitul Chametz is hefker, it's not really hefker either. Now listen to this. Because hefker means I'm taking something out of my rishus and I'm putting it into the rishus of hefker. Yeah, it's hefker. Hefker. In other words, in halacha, hefker is a zach. Hefker is something, it's a thing, like you're putting it into the hefker. And it's not just a din that anybody can take from hefker. Hefker is a rishus hefker. So the Mishnah Berurah says that's not really what's happening here. This is a big chiddush. But he says what's happening here is that really once chametz becomes aser, it's einer b'shusay shaladam. See, the Gemara says there's two things that einer b'shusay shaladam v'atar nasna ki'ilu b'shusay. One of them is a bar b'shusay rabbin. It's not my bar, but yet the Torah says you're responsible for it. A chiddush of the Torah. The other is chametz b'pesach. It's not really yours. Once it becomes aser, and it makes sense. The Ksais, I think, explains that it makes sense that it's not b'shusay shaladam because you have no hana from it. You're not allowed to eat it. You're chayv kares if you eat it on Pesach. So if it's so the Torah really said it's einoi b'shusay shaladam. Right? Only what they said. Nevertheless, there's a mitzvah of tashmisu zar mibatechem. You have to get rid of it anyway for some reason. It's something that the Torah says that you have to get rid of something. You have to take responsibility for this chametz. Mashma that the Torah wants us more to get rid of the chametz than it wants us to disown it. There's like, get rid of it, get it out of your life, get the chametz out of your life. That's what's going on Pesach.
How can we do it before it becomes aser?
How can you do it?
if you say it, it's
So
the
it's
whole
also
Metzius-
D'Rabbanan. It's also D'Rabbanan from the 10th day, but that's a good kasha. It's a good kasha. But this is what the Mishnah says. It's a good kasha, the Mishnah, but there are many kashas on this Mishnah. But what the point of it is, he says that it's not hefker in the normal way of the word, because normally hefker means that I take it out of my rishus and I put it into the rishus of hefker. But what it means over here is that it's already out of my rishus, but the Torah would put it back into my rishus. Listen carefully. And I'm saying Bitul Chametz. So Bitul Chametz means, no, I am not accepting it back into my rishus. So normally hefker is getting something out of my rishus. And here hefker is, stop. This is my boundary. You cannot come into my rishus. It is hefker. So the Mishnah explains, according to that, well, I mean, the Mishnah is talking about, I'll explain to you in a minute what the Mishnah is, what this Mishnah is for, but I just want to say the Yisoid. But Lagabe Didan with the law, which is really not what I want to talk about now, that it could be that according to Western law, there, even though you can't technically be mafker something, but you probably can say, again, I'm guessing on this, you probably can say, someone, let's say, hands you a gift, you probably can say, listen, I don't want that. I don't want to have anything to do with that. So probably it's like, you can't force me to accept something or to put something in my rishus. So that probably, I mean, I'm just saying from logic, that by logic, you can't say, you can't put something, narcotics or house or be mechayev me in something, or even if it's a schus for me. Even if it's a schus for me, I don't think you could force me to own a Yerusha.
It's called hefker. If I don't have any bilus on it at all and you want to give it to me, I can be mafkirid. It's not mine. How can I be mafkirid?
It's a special chiddush of the Torah, Torah not in the Bershus Shalom. The Torah, because since the Torah, what you're really doing, I think a better way of saying it, I don't want to improve on Shakespeare here or the Mishnah Berurah either, but I think what you're really doing is you're saying, I can, the Torah not in the Bershus, I have a din that works something like hefker, that I have to push it out of I have to not accept it into my rishus. That's what's really going on over here. Imkain, according to civil law, that's also a possibility. And that's what he says. That's what Bitul Chametz is. Bitul Chametz is not accepting it into your rishus. Not sure if that's true or not, but let's examine it for a minute and get to the point that I want to make.
In a way, we see with the device that the Chacham developed for Mishmeres Chametz, that they're going out of their way to help us remove any shemetz of the issur that we might have. So
well, to have any kesher. It's not a shemetz of issur, I think technically might be the wrong word, but not. I don't want to have any kesher to chametz. In other words, what the Torah is saying over here is don't have kesher to chametz. Chametz is okay. We don't have to get into the whole reason for why chametz is usher, but you don't want to have any kesher to chametz. You want to be pure. You want to be unplugged. You don't want to have any yufke blazenkite. You don't have any kesher to chametz. However you want to darshan this, but the fact is they don't have any kesher in lumdus. Let me tell. Now let's get back here for a minute. I'll show you something very interesting. In Tuf Lamed Beis, where I told you to open, in Sifkat Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah says this is not in the Shulchan Aruch, but it's in the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, in the second half of the Mishnah Berurah, Ein mevarchen al bedikas chametz. Why don't we make a bracha? Al bedikas chametz. We don't do that. What bracha do we make?
Al bir chametz.
Al bir chametz. Very good, HaRav. Al bir chametz. Why don't we make a bracha al bedikas chametz? So the Mishnah Berurah says, the ein ze soif mitzvasai. Because the bedika is just a part of what your end goal, what the end game here is to do bir chametz. So you make a bracha already on the end of the story, which is bir chametz. This is just one part closer to getting rid of the chametz. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is the part that I want to underline here. V'gam ein mevarchin al bitul chametz. You don't make a bracha on bitul chametz. Kivan de ikar habitul tali belev. You don't make a bracha on Bitul Chametz, you say Kol Chamir v'Chamir Dikir B'Shusi, but the ikar of it is not the saying it. The ikar is that you're, let's call it for a moment, relinquishing responsibility or ownership in that. And that's something you do with your heart. Well, haraya, if you say it and you don't mean it, unless Yitzchak is in front of a beis din, if you say it, you don't mean it, it's a garnish. It's not Bitul Chametz. So the main Bitul Chametz is Dvarim Shebelev. It says the Mishnah Berurah, Kimin de Iker Habitul Toli Belev, ve'ein mevarchen al Dvar Shebelev, and you don't make a bracha on Dvarim Shebelev. Okay, so here's a chiddush that the Mishnah Berurah says that you don't make a bracha on Dvarim Shebelev. Mechatei said that you don't make a bracha on Dvarim Shebelev.
The offering is called the Vodah Shebelev, but we don't make a Sugyos Chaim sets on the al tefillah. We don't do that.
Okay, you don't make a bracha on tefillah. You make a bracha on Kriya Shema, which is a mitzvah Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shemayim.
Sugyos Chaim sets on
Birchas Kriya Shema.
You have to be mashmea.
Doesn't know.
To be mashmea Kriya Shema.
Okay. Tefillah Yitaka don't make a bracha, but okay, I'm not arguing with the Chafetz Chaim here. I'm only saying that, like sometimes the Gadol Hador can give you a yisoid that I didn't know this works for everything, and that is that you don't make a bracha on a Dvarim Shebelev, period. Now we need to question that yisoid, and we have to check the yisoid, test the yisoid, and make sure it's true. But so far it makes some sense because you see we don't make a bracha on tefillah, and even on Kriya Shema, if we say Birchas Kriya Shema, as Yoni is saying, you still have to say it. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, right? You have to be Mashmiel Oznai. So it could be you have to do some kind of a Maisa, but something which is Rak, Davar Shebelev, the Mishnah Berurah says you don't make a bracha, and he's proving it with his proof. And that is, he's saying that that's why you don't make a bracha on Bitul Chametz. So I looked at this. He doesn't bring any source for this, does he? He says he doesn't bring a source. Interesting. Scheinberg always brings sources, but there is a source for it. It's a mefurish in the Beis Yosef in tough mefurish in the Beis Yosef in Tough Lamed Daled at the very end, and the Beis Yosef there quotes the Torah in Tough Lamed Vav. So the makor of this whole thing is the Torah, which is almost a Rishon. He's the son of the Rosh, who says, make a bracha on Dvarim Shebelev. So he's entitled to say. But it's interesting. The Torah itself doesn't bring the Torah itself doesn't bring a raya to this. He just says, look, this is what you see. Don't make a bracha on Dvarim Shebelev.
Are the brachas of Kriya Shema proper? They're like brachas before a mitzvah. It's not.
What is it? It's not Birchas HaShevach. Birchas HaKriya Shema.
It's like bracha before the mitzvah.
I mean, Avram Nadel is asking a good question. Why don't you say Asher Kinshanu Mitzvahs of Tzivanu Kriya Shema? Okay, that's a good question. So maybe it's not a bracha on Kriya Shema, but okay. I just like the fact that the Mishnah Berurah, the Beis Yosef, and the Torah said a klal, like the Rashba says klalim and brachas. They said a klal and brachas that ein mevarchen al dvarim shebelev. I have here, I don't know if you have it in front of you, the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah. Anybody have that? So he brings Rebbe Akiva Eiger, which I heard this Rebbe Akiva Eiger. Rebbe Akiva Eiger asks the question he says as follows. Lama mevarchen al parsha al hafrashas truma gam kishemafresh al yedei machshava. Now, hafrashas truma is hafrashas truma. Let's go back to biblical days, make it easier. Let's say you have food in front of you and you didn't take truma from it. So you allowed to eat it? No, not allowed to eat it. It's tevel. So you're not allowed to eat it. So what happens is your wife prepares a whole meal for Shabbos and nobody took truma from the meal. And now I can't eat it on Shabbos and I'm stuck without food. So it says the Shulchan Aruch, which is a Mishnah, that you're mafresh truma b'machshava. You're not allowed to be mafresh truma b'yadayim because that's called a tikkun mana, but you are allowed to be mafresh truma b'machshava. So you could say in your thoughts, I'm not even sure if you're allowed to say this. I think you can say with your mind that, okay, the tzafenzeit of this food is going to be truma, and of course you don't eat that part. And after Shabbos you give it to the kohen, but you can be mafresh truma b'machshava. Now normally, Rabbi Yaacov Haber points out, when you're mafresh truma, you make a bracha. Do you make a bracha when you're mafresh truma b'machshava? The answer is yes. You make a bracha. Fragt Rabbi Yaacov Haber, how can you make a bracha on mafresh truma or kisha mafresh b'machshava when he's not quoting the Mishnah Berurah, so he must mean the Beis Yosef, or he takes this clear. When you're not allowed to make a bracha on dvarim shebelev.
Haber, I don't understand exactly the question, because in that particular case, first of all, it's a b'diavad case, and second of all, it's not only a davar shebelev. He is making a discrete physical act of leaving something off. In other words, it's not the classic hafrashas truma where a person pulls off a portion and says hareza truma, but he is still doing a discrete physical act of leaving over part of the food and setting it aside for Motzei Shabbos. So I'm not sure the case is even a case where it's really different.
He's not setting anything aside, first of all. And you can leave that part in the kitchen. I'm just saying, like, you can eat without doing hafrashas meisers. But I hear it's a teretz. But let's get the kasha clear. I hear the teretz. So the kasha is, how are you allowed to be mafresh? How can you make a bracha on hafrashas truma b'machshava? So comes Pinchas and he says, well, it's not like Bitul Chametz where there's no mice involved at all. Ultimately, there's going to be a Maisa. So here's the lashon of Rabbi Yaacov Haber, who maybe you're a descendant of or something. So says Rabbi Yaacov Haber, Hoyel. Says this language is Rabbi Yaacov Haber, Madur Kama v'Shailos and Shuvas Siman Lamed. Says Rabbi Yaacov Haber, Hoyel Toras hafrashas truma he litna l'kohen. What are you doing this for? Are you doing it to give the truma to a kohen? So af hamafresh al yedei machshava. So, meaning ultimately there is a maisa attached to it, Rabbi Yaacov Haber says, and since there's a maisa attached to it, whether you're going to do the maisa on Saturday night or Tuesday or Wednesday, it doesn't make any difference. This is what you said basically, no? But since there's a maisa attached to it, so therefore you could already make a bracha on the machshava because it's not machshava great, it's machshava attached to a maisa. Kivin shesayfai lavai lidei maisa. Kloimar, I'm reading from Rabbi Yaacov Haber, Hanasina l'kohen. Avol b'Bitul Chametz. However, with Bitul Chametz, nasa hakol, the emphasis mine, b'machshavas halev. That's where it begins, that's where it ends. And something which begins in your heart and ends in your heart, merach nishkim bracha. So says Rabbi Yaacov Haber.
I separated and I never gave it to the kohen. It's not truma. So but I did it. He said it's finished once I've separated, once I made it hefker.
You're not making a hefker. You're not making a hefker. I'm saying this portion is going to the kohen.
I separate for the kohen and I never give it to him. Did I do anything?
Yeah. I believe you. No, I believe you. You're eating lamafreya. You're going to eat tevel. So the hafrasha really is accomplishing something here, even though it's a machshava. So let's say it this way. Let's say that that a machshava is actually accomplishing something chiyuvi. You make a bracha on. In other words, what we're doing here is we're being mocked in the cloud. We're being mocked in the cloud. It's not always that you don't make a bracha on machshava b'leiv. If the machshava b'leiv begins and ends in the leiv, then you don't make a bracha. So we're qualifying the klal of the Beis Yosef. Whereas if sofo shel davar is you got to give it to the Kohen. So I'm beginning my Maisa with my machshava. Soif Maisa b'machshava techila. Say that. I just want to point out that according to the Mishnah Berurah that I mentioned before, again, the Mishnah Berurah is in Taf Lamed Daled Sivkot and Tesvav. So you don't need this Taras of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, right? Help me, let's think together for a second. Mishnah Berurah says that when you're doing Bitul Chametz, you're not really being mafkir something. What you're doing is stopping it from coming into your rishus. So if that Mishnah Berurah is correct, so it means that what's the connection to Truma? By Truma, it's in my rishus. I'm kilu in my machshava taking out of my rishus, even without the Rabbi Akiva Eiger and Pinchas' chiddush. It could be you never make a bracha on Dvarim Shibalev. But over here, it's not Dvarim Shibalev. The Dvarim Shibalev is just stopping it from coming to me. Maybe on that case, you don't make a bracha. But if I'm actually doing a Maisa with my lave, maybe you would make a bracha. So it could be.
Is there a dig to?
I'm sorry.
Is there a dig to say in the Mishnah Berurah that he talks about Hana? That
Talks about what?
When he talks about Hana, like
Yeah.
he said. Where's it? I don't know. But in other words, like that's a factor. So let's say, I mean, with the Truma as well, if he's not having a non from it, he just leaves it. So he's done.
It's not a hafrasha.
It's still not hafrasha.
It's not a hafrasha. Hafrasha is you have to do hafrasha.
So it's only specifically in chametz that it.
So chametz is like it could be that chametz is a unique case that Bitul Chametz is really not doing anything at all. All it's doing is even the U.S. legal system will allow you to not accept this gift from Hashem. I don't want that chametz. I want to detach myself from the chametz. You're not relinquishing. So by truma, it's not really a kasha from truma because could be all the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, I'm just saying as far, all the Mishnah Berurah is saying is that when you're not taking something to stop something in your shus, you don't make a bracha. What are you making a bracha on? If you're actually taking something out of your rishus, you do make a bracha. So there's no kasha from truma to chametz. I'll just say this, that if that's true, what I just said is true, then the Mishnah Berurah is a little bit contradicting himself. Because here he says the reason you don't make a bracha is because it's dvarim shebalev. And in Tov Lamed Vav, he's saying you don't make a bracha because you're not really doing anything. So you have a bit of a stira because why is he saying dvarim shebalev and mixing us all up? What he should better say is you don't make a bracha because it's nothing. Bitul Chametz is just stopping something from coming into your ownership. What exactly are you making a bracha on? So the mashmos of the Mishnah Berurah here is the mashmos of the Mishnah Berurah here is that you don't make a bracha on dvarim shebalev, meaning that you are doing something. You're and the truth is that Mishnah Berurah, it's hard to understand because Rashi says mefurish that you're doing a mitzvah tashbisu, and Tosfos says mefurish you're doing the mitzvah by making something hefker. So I'm not sure where the Mishnah Berurah, it's not his chiddush, as I say, comes from the Beis Yosef, but I'm not sure how you could say a chiddush arguing with Rashi and Tosfos. I mean, you can say whatever you want, but he's arguing with Rashi and Tosfos. It says mefurish, it's hefker, or tashbisu, you're making it kafir dalma.
If it's before Zman Isser, so it wasn't taken away from you yet, so that's when it's the Dvarim Shebalev. Then you have to be matzah. It wasn't taken away. You're not stopping it from coming back.
You're assuming this whole time, this is the second time you're saying this, so you're assuming that you can do Bitul Chametz, that's called Bitul Chametz, before the Zman Isser.
We do it at night.
We do the first part of it. But in other words,
we say hefker.
Yeah, but then you eat breakfast. Then you eat breakfast. Then you eat challah for breakfast.
Right. No, but we're having in mind not that challah, but the stuff that we didn't find that we were trying to get rid of.
Okay, so for sure there's no chiyuv. So how can you make a bracha? That's for sure you can't make a bracha on.
So no, okay. So what about in the morning? So in
the morning, once the Rabbanan said it's usher. So which is
so if you did the nafkamina was if you did bittul before that zman, there would be a nafkamina.
Yeah, nachon. No, in other words, the done the whole kasha before if you do it. If I go today, 30 days before Pesach, and I do Bitul Chametz, for sure you don't make a bracha. I don't have any mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? What bracha are you going to make? What? There's no din of bir chametz now. So what you're doing at night, there's no din of bir chametz. For sure you don't make a bracha. The shaila is, if you do Bitul Chametz at 10:02 or 10:06 rather this year, and you're saying, okay, the Rabbanan say that it's in my rishus, but I'm not allowed to eat it. So the Isser Chametz l'chor is chal, and now I can get it out of my rishus or take it out of my rishus. But okay, but I don't want to. The main point I want to make here is that the Isser Rashi and Tosfos both say that you're taking the chametz and you're being mafkirat. The Mishmeres is qualifying and saying, well, it's not exactly hefker, it's a little bit different, okay, but I'm just saying I'm a balabas. The hefker is hefker, and tashvisu is tashvisu. And there are two chidushim that I could take something which has value and say that it's kaf or dar, I could say it's dust. And I could take something which is in my rishus and say it's not in my rishus. And the question is, which way does Bitul Chametz work? But those are two, what did you call them, Yoni, before? Two devices that can be used to not be over the Isser of Bayura Bayamotze on Pesach.
Rav Haber, it sounds like when we finish Bir Chametz, that we shouldn't make the last declaration until a minute into the Zman, which there's an Isser Chal on the Chametz, and not before?
That's what Yitzchak is telling on. Like, is there an exact Zman for Bitul Chametz, which would be a huge chiddush of everything we're learning here today, which is important learning in the background here. There would be a chiddush that if that's an afkamina, if I'm being mafkaret, so you have to be mafkaret maybe after the Zman. But it could. Let me say this one last thing. The truth is that there's another half to everything I want to say, which I guess we'll do next week, but because it's already 10:15. But I just want to say, I just realized this moment that it could be what the Mishmeres is actually saying is it works with all the dinim of hefker. Meaning you're taking chametz, which is in your rishus, and you're getting it out of your rishus. But what the Mishmeres is explaining is it's hefker, but it's not a normal case of hefker. Because a normal case of hefker is much more chamur. Because in a normal case of hefker, you're somehow or another doing what even the law says you can't do most of the time, and that's relinquishing ownership. This, he says, is not like it's like hefker light. Maybe that's what the Mishnah means. He's not saying it's not hefker. Rashi says, Tosfos says it's hefker, but what he's saying is it's not the normal case of hefker, because what's really happening is it's very, very shvach. The fact that it's in your rishus to begin with is very weak. So you're getting something which is not really in your rishus, out of your rishus. So for just to impress the lawyers amongst us here, that's sui generis to the idea of taking something out of your rishus hefker lagamri. It's a lo domeh. So maybe that's what the Mishnah is saying, like a dakistika thing. Don't learn from there to every other kind of hefker, and therefore it's a shvacha thing. But therefore, the Mishnah is correct in saying in Taf Lamed Beis Sifkat and Aleph, he's correct in saying that look, whatever you're doing there, it's something, whatever you're doing there, it's a dvar, you have to do hefker, and it's a davar shebelev. It's a different kind of hefker, but it's still a davar shebelev, and he sticks with his klal of davar shebelev. In Taf Lamed Daled, all he's doing is explaining that this is a minacher shel hefker. It's not the regular hefker. It's more like Yitzchak said at the beginning. Yitzchak Samet said at the beginning, if it's hefker, why don't you have to have a beis din? According to the Ramah in Choshen Mishpat, when you do hefker, it's not a hefker without a beis din. So the answer is, according to the Mishmeres, we can understand that because it's not normal hefker. It's a different type of a hefker. Like if you're doing shiluach hakan, you mamish have to be mafker the place. But over here, it's not a regular hefker. It's a special kind of a hefker that it's einer b'rshus shel adam, v'atar nitna b'rshus shel adam. So it's like a weak b'rshus shel adam. So therefore, the hefker that's required, the device that's needed, is not as strong. And that would explain Yitzchak why you wouldn't need a beis din, even according to Tosfos. Okay, this is my introduction to the shir. Does anybody have any questions before we go? You can unmute. I don't know. Okay, I don't hear everything.
It seems like it's not entirely balev until the zman of the isur is chal, because before that time, like the truma, it's in your rishus, even if it's weak rishus, and you're removing it from your rishus. So it's not entirely balev until there's the isur.
Okay, but you can't compare Yisachar. You can't compare what's going to happen with truma, where there's an actual mice in the sina, to the fact that all of a sudden it becomes usher, and I have to give it, and I'm not allowed to own it. It's still no ma'isa. It's lave. So, okay, something to think about. And I think there's a lot of the halachas of bedikas chametz and bitul chametz which are going to come from these yesodis of tashbisu, and I wish everybody a good gebencht vach.